Hi, everyone. I'm Charlie Melcher, the founder of the Future of Storytelling Summit, and I'd like to welcome you to today's virtual roundtable conversation. We're so excited to have with us today Andrea Phillips. Hi, Andrea. Welcome.
Hello.
Andrea is a transmedia writer and game designer and author who's worked on many award-winning projects for companies such as HBO, Sony Pictures, Canadian Action Channel, and UK's Channel 4, among others. And she is the author. She literally wrote the book on transmedia creation, A Creator's Guide to Transmedia Storytelling. It's a wonderful primer, and I recommend everyone read it. In addition, Andrea is one of the co-founders of a augmented reality community, right, called the Cloud. Is that correct, Andrea? No, sorry, I'm getting the name wrong.
It was Cloud Makers, an alternate reality gaming community. It's history at this point. Don't worry about it.
Oh, sorry, I didn't realize. Okay.
No, it's good. It's good.
History is good. Yes, we like history.
Exactly. So welcome, Andrea. So happy to have you here with us. We also have an illustrious panel today, really high-powered group. So Karl, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, my name's Karl Goodman. I'm the executive director of the Museum of the Moving Image. To a certain extent, we have evolved at the museum into being about what all of you here in this group do. We're also connected to the rich history of film, television, and digital media and try to look at things along a historical continuum. I should also say that I began at the museum as its curator of digital media. As far as we know, the first such title to have existed starting in 1992. And so this event allows me to take off my director's hat a bit and remember what it was like to be creative.
Well, great. Thank you. Welcome. Nice to have you with us, Karl. Hi, Lina. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Lina Srivastava, and I'm a social innovation strategist in New York. I work at the intersection of creative media, storytelling, and human rights and global development. So my work in transmedia is transmedia activism. So it's looking at how we use transmedia storytelling to create new narrative models and new digital distribution models for human rights and global development. I work on the one hand with documentary films, like Born to Brothels, and the most recent is Who is Diane Cristal. And then I also work with institutions like the World Bank and the UN, like UNICEF and UNESCO.
Very impressive. Thank you for joining us. Hi, Steve.
Hi.
Welcome.
Thank you. I'm Steve Coulson. I'm a creative director in New York at a marketing company called Campfire. Campfire works with brands and entertainment properties using storytelling techniques, digital, social, and increasingly transmedia techniques to launch new products or new brands or new entertainment properties and change perceptions. We worked with HBO. We worked with HBO on a number of projects, including the launch of True Blood Season 1 and Season 2, Game of Thrones Season 1 and Season 2. We've recently been working with Cinemax on Hunted. We've worked with USA Networks and Discovery Channel, as well as non-entertainment brands such as Harley-Davidson and Snapple and a few others in that vein. So I am fairly new to the transmedia world, but then aren't we all?
So that's a perfect place for us to jump in. So first, let me just say and remind people who are joining us that we welcome your questions and your participation in today's conversation. And please feel free to send us any questions to this illustrious panel through our Twitter handle, which is @FoST.org, or you can send questions in through joining our Google Plus circle. So this is a perfect place to start this conversation, which is we're all new to transmedia, and how does this really differ from the history of regular media? Andrea, do you want to sort of weigh in a little bit on that? I mean, let me just sort of put it this way. I grew up watching World Wrestling Federation and seeing some great storytelling that took place across multiple platforms. Was that transmedia storytelling?
I would say it wasn't then, but it is now. Gosh, there are so many things I want to say all at the same time. I mean, transmedia really isn't something that was invented all at once as soon as the internet came into being. Definitely not. I think what's happened is we've always had this tool of creating discrete bits of a single work and making an experience across media that winds up being greater than the sum of its parts. I think that's existed for a very long time. But digital media in particular let us do some interesting things with scale and with interaction that you can't do for thousands of people at once any other way. And what I mean is, without the internet, it's not possible to provide an experience to people in 20 countries where they feel like they're actually best friends with your lead character in the story. Whereas if they're sending, emails and Twitters and commenting back and forth on Facebook pages for, a month or two, then the audience does feel like they have that real connection to the events of the story. So I think that's the really interesting virgin territory where we're starting to hack our way into.
I know, Andrea, you've talked with me a little bit, about the different experience of writing for transmedia versus writing for, say, a novel or a film. Would you care to sort of go into that a little bit?
Would I? No, I used to try and write flat novels, and I have a couple in a box somewhere, and they're both really pretty bad. And it's just not as fun because you write something, even in a best case, you spend a year writing something. If it's a screenplay, it's even worse. You spend a year writing it, and then it's 3 and 4 and 5 years in production. And finally, at the end of that, you get to have some idea of what people actually think of this work that you did all that time ago. And as a creator, it's really hard to improve and grow with no feedback on a time scale of years, really. Whereas all of these digital media let you do something and put it out there, in dozens of minutes in some cases. And not only do you have an audience right away, but a lot of times you get to sneak peek into your audience's conversations with each other and see what they really think about the thing that you made. And the process of this sort of instant feedback loop is tremendous, and it's addictive, and it's fun. And even on top of that, it lets you influence your work going forward from that moment, so that the thing that you were going to do next week may become a completely different thing, because suddenly the audience has given you an idea that you never would have had in a million years until they said that one little thing to you. Do you want me to tell my moth story?
Sure.
I did a project called Floating City with Thomas Dolby a couple of summers ago. And it was a browser trading game with inventory items. One of those items was a moth. And it was a very common item, and our players started to complain about how common it was. They said, I think they're breeding in our hold while we're not looking. We thought, we could make that happen. So we put in a little bit of code. So every 16 hours, if you had 2 moths, you would get 1 more moth. And it took a few days for them to notice, and then it sort of spiraled out of control, moths everywhere. And there was this huge sort of audience reaction to it. Ultimately, it became a giant part of the storyline of the whole experience, and they were trying to get rid of the moths, and then they were trying to rescue them because there was a moth plague, and the moths were eating other inventory items. It was this whole big thing that we had never planned to do, but because we had been listening when they said, I think this is happening, and we had the liberty to change in the moment and make that happen, the experience was tremendously better and more fun for us and also for them.
Boy, is that not the dream of every author throughout civilization, to be able to get into the mind a little bit of their reader as the story is unfolding for them?
No, I can't speak for every reader, but I speak for me. You know, a lot of the reason that I'm out here is deep insecurity. I just want everybody to really love me. So yeah, no. So I put things out there, and if I can have a reaction, then I feel like maybe people love the thing I made and sort of love me a little bit as a result.
So how does Lina? How does some of this apply to sort of social good when you're out there trying to influence people's actual behavior in a positive way?
Sure. It's actually less the way I look at transmedia storytelling. Sort of the qualities of it in terms of immersion, architecture, like having an actual strategy behind it, and participation, like those three elements of transmedia storytelling. There are many more that are required. Are key, right? Are key to social change. Whether you're thinking about general audiences or you're thinking about influencers, the way I do transmedia is much more on the strategy and the design than it is on the production, right? So I'm not necessarily looking at the experience of the platform in terms of the content. I'm looking at the strategy behind it. That's the work that I do, right? So in terms of transmedia storytelling for social change, right, what we're trying to do is we're trying to make sure that at the one of the things that happens in human rights or global development in generally is that the voice of the people sort of in the community that's experiencing the most pain is often left off the table, right? So we're very top down in the way we actually create. We're very solutions based. We're not based on process. And so the act of creating a transmedia platform for social change, just in that exercise of bringing people in and bringing their stories in and making sure that their voice is an essential element, in that way transmedia is extremely powerful.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's interesting what I'm hearing from sort of both of you is just this idea of that through transmedia we can kind of bring in the voices of the people who were traditionally left out of the process of storytelling, right? Which tended to be one dimension or unidirectional, right, from the top down.
You know, I think that's Charles. I think that's a really important facet of transmedia storytelling. I think as we grow as a community and people start to become familiar with that term, there's a lot of talk about content and channels. But for me, I think the central part of it is the participation by the audience. You know, I think we've all consumed different stories, as Andrea said, across different platforms for the last 100 years, even more so. There have been movies, and then there have been novelizations, and there have been components that kind of go together. But because of the nature of media, of broadcast media, our role in participation has usually been one just to tune in. I'll tune in here, I'll tune in there, I'll pick up the magazine and read it. And starting with digital, and then especially with social channels, the nature of how I can participate in a story changed. Now that may be deep dive participation in the way that you have an alternate reality game where there are puzzles and clues and characters to interact with. But even the act of choosing to move from channel to channel and in which order you do that and how long you spend with it and having some control over that is an act of participation. And you know, in a lot of the work we do, it's kind of changed the way we think of audiences into, we talk about fan culture a lot, and fan culture breaking out of just, you know, Star Wars and Star Trek fans, but and large fan bases. People who love wine, that's a fan community, and people who love books, that's a fan community. And social is enabling fan communities to come together, and you see that's where a lot of the active participation in transmedia comes from. And that active participation is really, really exciting. I mean, Andrea gave you her story of the moth. I can give you another story that Andrea and I both participated in for Game of Thrones when we did a sensory campaign for Game of Thrones that involved sending out components based on the 5 senses. One of those components was a scent box that had scrolls, and you could take them apart and mix them and smell the world. One of the scrolls were handcrafted, and one of the fan communities, the largest fan community, Winter is Coming, received one of the scrolls and saw there were clues to puzzles, and then realized that if they held it up to the light, they could perceive a message in the scroll, a watermark, and some work was done in Photoshop to identify this message hidden in the watermark of the scroll. And they realized that the message said always support the bottom. And there was some discussion about what that could mean. Now, I'm guessing some point when we were making those scrolls, it was underneath a container that had the message on always support the bottom when you picked it up. So it was completely accidental. But they found that out, and they laughed and they enjoyed that. And then Andrea and I, as we were working through a later part of the program, we worked always support the bottom into one of the puzzles, so it became part of the story that the fans had created. And to this day, if you go to winteriscoming.net, which is the largest fan community for Game of Thrones, and buy their official T-shirt, their motto is always support the bottom on their T-shirt, which is a really nice way that the fans participated and became part of that story.
That's great.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say I'm almost jealous, because in the social change space, it's very hard to do things like scent boxes and multiple moths and things. And I mean, to a certain extent, I've been asked to do things like that. Right? I've been asked. Andrea, you've worked on an amazing social issue game. America 2049 is amazing, but it's really hard to do games in the social change space. It's really hard to do sort of these creative things, because the tension between at least activism and art is always there, right, to a certain extent, and art as commerce.
There are a whole bunch of tensions there too. There's the tension between using someone's sort of true story and representing them fairly, versus actually having a dramatic portrayal of something that someone might care about. Right. So you wind up seeing a lot of sort of amalgamations of characters which may not necessarily be genuine. And then there's this tension between making something that people find sort of entertaining and engaging, and figuring out how to take that and harness it.
Yeah, see, the difference is between engagement and entertainment. That's where the tension lies for me.
Mm-hmm.
I'm working on this project right now called Who is Danny Crystal, which is about immigration and migration. It's very timely at the moment. We've been working on it for 4 or 5 years now, but it's like the immigration debate has hit, right, this spring. So we're sort of using it, and early on we were asked if we wanted to do a game around this, and it floored me, because I was like, why would I do a game around migrants who are trying to come into our country and dying at the border? Right? And there have been proposals floated, and I've seen proposals floated where you'd want to have games attached to that. And so I find that really, really problematic. So in the space, at least of social change, I find the entertainment components extremely challenging. So engagement takes on a whole other sort of quality, and participation takes on a whole other quality. Like, is participation enough?
Yeah.
Like, see what you were saying, participation, Charles, what you were saying, participation is key. I think it's absolutely key, but what does that mean in terms of social change, at least like when you're thinking about that? Because participation in and of itself is not enough.
Just to address the question of games in the space of social media, I was actually a few weeks ago at a indie gaming conference at Karl's Museum, and there was a game there called Cart Life that I got to play, and it was a game to create a kind of empathy with the characters and their very sort of benign or banal lives that they were living, and it really got you sort of into the experience of these characters who were immigrants and working in newsstands or simple menial jobs. Anyway, I know that there are games out there that can create a tremendous sense of empathy for the plight of others, and I think that's a really interesting opportunity to use gaming in sort of social causes.
I would say, and I'm going to have to peel backward from what I first wanted to say 5 minutes ago to react to what you said. I think in some of the, let's call them experimental games, which is in a sense a subset of independent games, perhaps related, they're often looking at certain structure ideas related to structure at a very granular level that can be applied to other products and other stories. I find it's really, really useful, just with as well as with experimental film, to look at some of these works, even if they are necessarily, some of them, abstract and related to almost about a storytelling idea, rather than employing a technique to elicit a certain response. So I do invite everyone to look at this sort of material, like what Charlie mentions. There was a game at the festival called it's one of these words. There was an interactive product at the festival called Unmanned that was also interesting within this context. Moli Industria from Italy played a game recently called Papa and Yo, which takes place in a favela. A young boy. It's in a sense a traditional 3D platformer, but within it is a story that is very personal to the creator, because the boy has a pet monster who helps him get out of trouble and helps him get out of his surroundings, and but the monster can turn evil and attack him. And it turns out the creator had an alcoholic father, and in a way the monster for him is that father. So you have sort of a broader, let's call it social or global issue, which is poverty in South America, dealt with also a very strong personal issue within a context of an entertaining product. And I think that the hope is, while you will have a lot of really interesting, let's say, foundation and NGO-funded transmedia game experiences, what I'm specifically interested in is the idea that again, a product will come out organically out of the interests and needs of authors and artists, and deal almost naturally with social issues, just like the films of John Sayles or Steven Soderbergh might address these things. And there is a role for drama and engagement, and yes, even that the E-word, entertainment, in serious products. The other thing that I would say is, I found it interesting when people were talking about participation. Steve had mentioned the idea of selecting channels. I do think that by conflating selectivity with the notion of participation, kind of devalues the idea of, let's say, call it true participation. But I remember when people were looking at DVDs as an interactive medium, because you could choose to listen to commentary, you can jump to this chapter. David Lynch and film critics got really upset that people could access a movie in a nonlinear fashion that they intended to be experienced from start to finish, and Lynch made sure that you couldn't do that in his films. And sure, that there was a kind of element of interactivity, but then what started to happen is people started to create their own DVD commentary and put it online and ask people to just play the file while they watch the movie. And I found that there's a sense in which participation also results in a change in the product or experience itself. And I think that for individuals who are to really truly be engaged by what we call at the museum participatory media instead of transmedia, they have to perceive the result of their actions in the product. And as an author, of course, you have to be open to letting behavior, emergent behavior, into the process and have the product shaped not just by you, the ringleader, but also by the participants.
So well said, and I think that that's sort of at the crux right now of what a lot of different storytellers or authorship are going through, right? What level can they let go of control, absolute, ironclad control over their narrative, and open it up to being a participatory or collaborative experience with their readers. And there's all sorts of stops on that spectrum, from things that are truly crowdsourced, created from scratch, to at the other end, the novel that's just written and set in stone.
But I think that's why we end up talking about games quite a lot when we talk about transmedia, because one of the things that they often have in common is the reader or the consumer as character, or whether an active character or a passive component of the story within that as well. And that's obviously something that's very relevant in game culture as well, putting myself at the center of a first-person adventure. And we found in our work that that means thinking not like an author or a storyteller, but more like a world builder. And trying to imagine the landscape into which those participants will walk out onto the stage, so you can kind of set up the props, set up the setting, but allow them to wander a little bit within that. So you know, we work with a lot of more traditional kind of showrunners and filmmakers and storytellers who are used to telling a fairly linear story, and we try to help them expand that out into story world, just to create a canvas, not necessarily just to allow it to franchise, but more to allow a place for the consumer to become an author within the story.
This is one of the things I'm not fundamentally sure I agree about. We've been talking. I mean, the transmedia community is always in a sort of paralysis about what transmedia means, and I think one of the reasons is that we're not always talking about the same thing when we use the word transmedia. And it's not that the word is failing us, but I've been thinking a lot lately that we need a taxonomy now of subcategories of kinds of things you can do once you've accepted this spreading things out over multiple platforms. So, you know, this thing I talk about, you know, emotions of agency, making people feel proud and guilty and frustrated, is one kind of a thing you can do in transmedia. But something isn't necessarily not transmedia just because it doesn't do that. I don't know what that taxonomy would look like yet, but I've been thinking about it really hard because it's clear that there's still a language issue that needs to be resolved. However, I don't think throwing out the word transmedia is the way to resolve it, because it still does mean something that is helpful. So.
At a certain point, it's going to be media. But you're right that at this stage in existence, we need a word to describe this thing.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. I don't think that we need to throw the word out either, and I think a taxonomy is actually a really good idea. At the same time, I'm of two minds, because I'm just like, to a certain extent, I don't care. I think the paralysis that you're absolutely right that exists in the transmedia community about the term makes my eyes glaze over sometimes. I'm like, let's just get on with it. Let's just produce the work and do the strategies. But at the same time, how do we define the work that we're doing, right? So I'm conflicted myself. I'm of two minds, but it's not a discussion I try to get into, because in the work that I'm trying to do, whether it's transmedia, cross-media, whatever, it's really about the participation. And the term that I struggle with even more is participation, right? Because in the social activism space, it goes back to the question I asked earlier, what is true participation? What does that really mean? Does in the social change space, does clicking on a petition mean participation? Like in my mind, it kind of doesn't. Or when, like, you know, Jeff Gomez just wrote his piece about Veronica Mars, I think it was 2 days ago or yesterday, when he talked about sort of this effort to get the Veronica Mars film made through Kickstarter. He called that, I think he called it participative storytelling or participatory. And I don't find sort of launching a Kickstarter campaign and participating in the campaign storytelling. You know?
No.
So, and I think that framing was really interesting because it's about fan culture.
Yeah.
But don't you think that was a participatory event? I mean, the Veronica Mars Kickstarter is obviously very current, and there's been a lot of talk about it. I mean, the participation is not about the film. I mean, whatever the film is like, good or bad, it's a minor blip compared to what the fans felt that day. That day of the Kickstarter will never be reproduced for them. It was a day of celebration, of coming out after all those years. So to me, the story that happened for those fans happened on that day. In a way, it's kind of over already, because the movie is just like a coda. The main event was what happened in that 24 hours.
As someone who contributed a fair number of dollars to that campaign, whether the movie is good or bad hardly even matters to me at this point. The mere act of telling the world that I loved it, and being able to fantasize now for the next year about where those characters are that I loved so much back in the day, and where they've gone is adequate. I mean, that's the value for my dollar right there, regardless of whatever happens with the film. If they never make the film, I still have probably gotten value for my dollar out of feeling like I was a part of this thing and getting to think about it.
Rob Thomas has got a strong challenge now because the film will never live up, I think,
No,
to the hope from that one day.
Should
never.
just not make it. I mean, basically leave it up to people's imaginations.
That would be even worse, actually.
Terrible.
So I actually have a funny story that takes me back to the origins of my experience in publishing, but it's really what I consider to be my very first baptism in transmedia storytelling. And it's when I was a young pup in publishing, and I was starting out as a partner in a small book packaging company, and we had the great honor to do a book for Madonna called Madonna Sex.
I remember that book.
I remember that one too.
So that was a big book back that year. In fact, it was the best-selling book of the year. And Madonna was this genius transmedia storyteller. So she started that project by leaking pieces about the making of the project to the press. So there were started to be in what was social media then, which was called Page 8 or the gossip columns. People were writing pieces about Madonna being seen having sex in groups or naked on the streets of Florida or with dogs, or I don't know, like crazy things that got people just so excited. And then as it got closer, it was all under tight wraps, and she did an album that was being released simultaneously with the book, also with the same name, Veronica, and then there was the launch party, and this was like, the media went into a froth. They were so crazed with this launch party where there were supposedly sex acts happening and people in leather and bondage and all of that the night before the worldwide simultaneous release where the book had been under armed guards and people like couldn't get it. We even designed it so you had to it was in this big condom package. If you remember, it was hard to open and it was sealed. And so the expectation was the anticipation was so amazing leading up to that release that it was one of the most successful single-day releases ever. You'd see people leaving the store with 5, 6, 10 copies, and basically it sold out in the U.S. in the first day. And I always remember thinking that then when people got home with the book and they finally violated it and got in, it was an anticlimax. Like the book wasn't really the point. The point was just how excited you'd been for all of those months leading up to being able to go out and buy the thing. So anyway, it just reminded me of what you were saying about in a way the film doesn't even matter now. It was the ability to sort of participate in the fantasy of what was going to happen.
Well, I think there's a long history of this idea of public conversation being created around a media work. The media work is often, let's call it the dominant platform around which or on top of which all of this conversation might take place. And we have in our collection, of course, Star Wars fan fiction, but also licensed products, ways that manufacturers, licensees who are paying, let's say, Paramount Pictures money to create products that allow someone to bring in the world of the film into their personal life, whether it's a lunchbox they carry in their hand or a t-shirt, bring in the internet, and then, boy, you kick this thing into high gear. What I found fascinating was the moment, actually, I'm sure it happened before, but for me, the moment when the conversation and the what's created on top of the dominant platform became the product is with the film AI, when in a way all that was happening online were you involved in that, Andrea? I didn't know that.
I was one of the moderators of the giant Yahoo group.
Okay, we'll do a Do You Know. Don Buckley at Warner Brothers kind of commissioned it, which is great, to promote the movie. I think it was a Jordan 42 Entertainment. I don't know. We'll have to we tried to collect this stuff in the museum because we found it fascinating and found it very difficult to do. I'm sorry to say, no pressure to any of you.
Call me later. I have all this stuff.
Oh, good.
I can hook you up with a complete archive, and actually, there are some other resources on the Yahoo group I would love to see archived elsewhere.
Exactly, and we collect memes, and if that's talk about difficult. Also, because again, no pressure on any of you, but in a way, all these conversations you're having, perhaps about taxonomies and terminologies, what I find is that over time, and after a number of years have passed, historians and theorists begin to try to systematically describe what it is you're doing, and my hope is that you'll just keep doing it, whatever it is, and then leave it to these social scientists and historians and so on to figure out how history will judge the role that you've played in the development of media.
Well, the conversation matters in the moment, mainly because there are things like PGA coming up with a definition of transmedia to determine whether or not you can be an officially accredited transmedia producer, or do the Tribeca Film Institute coming up with criteria to decide whether you're eligible for grant money. So they have to have some sort of objective criteria to measure whether you're transmedia or not, which involves, coming up with some stab in the dark at a definition. They can't just say, we know it when we see it. And then this causes soul searching on the part of an individual creator. Well, do I qualify as that thing that they're looking for? I'm doing something that I think is interesting and cool and innovative, but I don't know if it's that particular interesting, cool, innovative thing that they want right now. So it really does matter in the moment for career reasons.
Absolutely, and as an evaluator of grant proposals in this in the Rockefeller Foundation's new forms category, where they threw everything that didn't quite fit into, and that was a creative capital also. Rockefeller, anyway, this is an old, the whole history and sort of certainly independent video and film and installation, and suddenly they had all the stuff that didn't quite fit. And I wasn't on the panel, I got to help them decide which category certain works went into, and again, a DVD was mistakenly thought of as interactive at the time. So this is, of course, extremely useful to you, but I do think the transmedia is ultimately transitory because, again, as a term, as media evolves, my kids expect their media to be the way you're creating it, and are surprised when they can't engage with a story on multiple platforms, and that's a great sign. And I think that my concern is sometimes with and this is not, everyone here is doing real work. There is a trendiness that we must be aware of, where I feel, it's smart at a cocktail party saying I'm involved in transmedia, but yes, you'll have commercial enterprises commissioning transmedia projects, advertisers doing so, businesses built on it. It's a very exciting time.
Sure, it's funny, at a cocktail party or similar sort of random assortment of adults hanging out, I go out of my way to avoid ever saying a word about what I do because I hate trying to explain it. It's just never worth the trouble.
Yeah, I've never used the word transmedia at a cocktail party.
In public. Well,
I write for marketing companies. That's the most boring possible way to say anything I've ever done.
I get parents of college students reaching me now saying, my son, is graduating from school and wants to be a transmedia artist. And so that's really interesting. And to see film schools begin to call themselves something else. USC is the School of Cinematic Arts, thanks to George Lucas. NYU had a film studies department that's now moving image studies. When academia begins to react, and again, they are a reactive type of institution in academia, you're going to see potentially what you're doing institutionalized, and the time is now to do really exciting things, I think, because once it does become institutionalized, people are going to be trained to make transmedia. And what I love to see from all of you is it just coming, almost experimenting and trying new things and really defining the medium as you do so.
I try.
I think institutionalization is, as you just said, that you're absolutely right. I think it's scary. It's a little scary in terms of transmedia because the core of transmedia storytelling, or any of these forms, is that sort of inherent, and I hate to use the word, but that inherent innovation, right? It's that inherent sort of organic. The beauty of a transmedia storytelling platform is that it is both architected and managed and stewarded, but also organic. And I think that institutionalization of these forms could be, I want to see more people trained in this. I want to see more people. I want to see the industry built. I want to see more revenue streams. But institutionalization, that word, when it sort of like is combined with transmedia storytelling, I think I find that problematic.
It's hysterical, actually. I have no horse in institutionalization or not. If we remain just sort of gritty indie art forever, I would probably be just as happy. Which is hysterical because I've written this book that I know is being used at universities, in various places. But my publisher, I say this, don't tell McGraw, they're probably watching. They sold it as a marketing book, but deep in my heart, it really is a sort of field guide for indie filmmakers, or the college student who thinks, maybe I want to make something. How do I go about this? To try and map out some of the common rookie mistakes, because there are 4 and 5 mistakes that everybody winds up learning the hard way are bad ideas. And if I could have prevented some people from making some of those super common rookie mistakes, going in and editing Wikipedia to put in stuff that isn't strictly true, and putting real missing girl flyers out on your college campus, if I can keep people from doing those things, then my work is done.
Excellent.
It's such an exciting time, and what I think I'm hearing is somehow the opportunity to sort of cut new ground, to break new boundaries, is part of what's really fueling all of you right now, and it's why having it be institutionalized or codified or taught in academia sort of feels like the opposite of the creativity, the unbound creativity that's being applied now. I just wonder. I so agree with you, Karl, when you say that the word transmedia is going to be sort of let go of, and we're going to just call it media, and because this is a term that's a transitionary term as we go from these distinct media silos into this place where it's okay to create across them. But do we feel that means that there's going to be some new evolution or convergence that's taking place from the different disciplines, from the field of film and games and let's say writing, authors? Are they all going to move into something that is in the middle? Are people going to need to be able to do all of those things?
Gosh, I feel like, let me sort of come at this from a couple of different angles. I feel like I tend to do much better work when I'm on a team of people who are equally skilled at all of the different components of technology and visual design, film production, as I might be at sort of writing or structural design. But at the same time, there's definitely room for an individual to go out and just try and do all of the pieces to see what they come up with. I mean, I have an indie project right now I'm sort of launching, that's basically just me seeing how far I can get on my own. So I don't know that we're going to see it collapse one way or the other. But on the other hand, the person who is good at writing is not necessarily the person who is good at even designing a book cover, much less designing, an entire website and producing a film. So I don't know. I don't know where it'll go.
So you think it's collaborative now?
When has most art ever not been collaborative? Right? I mean,
Oh,
there are
snap.
very few people. Right? I mean, that's the thing. Like, there are very few people. And even like Da Vinci had a whole suite of people who are just filling in the paintings or helping with the sculpture. No artist, I think, has ever worked solely alone. There's always been a suite of people always helping. Art is a collaborative experience.
But I do think, it's interesting saying that the word transmedia will devolve to media. The thing that really excites me is how media itself is converging. I mean, I look at my kids who watch TV and YouTube and Netflix on their iPad, and the younger ones don't understand the difference. They don't see a difference between web video and TV. They don't see a difference between on-demand and broadcast. And we're starting to see that as well with animation, with words, with sounds and text, and how they come together. I think the distinctions between media is converging on solo devices where everything is absorbed and they kind of merge together. And I think that's really interesting because it means we're starting to create new forms of media. Certainly for us, whenever we come to a project, we don't think of channels, we think of the story, and then if the media doesn't exist to tell that story, then we kind of create it.
I think the major shift is going to be not necessarily from I think we are going to do away with the word transmedia. I don't think we're going to need it. eventually. But the shift is from all of us thinking of ourselves as either filmmakers or writers or whatever into storytellers. Like we're all storytellers, and we use different forms, right? And also sort of the expansion of form into experience, right? So we're creating experiences, not necessarily thinking about. I mean, you think about the form as a means of experience, not necessarily I'm making a film.
I would disagree. I think there will always be a place for the authored story, because experiences are all well and good, but if you put me in too much control of the experience that I'm having, it might be really lousy, to be honest.
I'm not saying that there won't be authored stories. I'm saying that we're not going to be necessarily thinking about things dependent on the form only, or the format, or the channel, right? Which is how we're sort of thinking about things now. Like we have television shows, and we have movies, and we have, I mean, we have things that are going to go up on Google Glass, right?
Well, we may not think about sort of end viewing devices, but there will certainly be a distinction between, and this needs to be video, and this needs to be text. So in that extent, to that extent, there will always be some sort of difference. I mean, the written word has been with us for thousands of words now, and I don't think it's going to go completely away anytime very soon. God, I hope not.
I hope it doesn't. But what I mean is that we've been constrained by form and format, right? So we think of the 22-minute situation, the 60-minute or 55-minute, sort of hour-long procedural, or the 86-minute documentary, or the 120-minute film. Like we're so constrained by those things, right? We're so constrained by it. I'm not saying that we're going to be doing away with any of those particular kinds of actual forms of expression. No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm talking about how we've been thinking about how we create content.
But form has always been really determined by the means of distribution, the channels of distribution, right? There's a reason why they are that length, or that shape, or that size, or that weight, because it's how to get it to. And with the democratization of distribution, some of those distinctions completely go away. I mean, there is no need for what should a length of a video piece be? Does it matter? As long as it needs.
It's interesting to note too. We think those things are standardized when really they're not. I was in the Philippines for several years when I was a little girl, and I remember watching Spider-Man on the local channels, and it was weird and awkward because all the TV commercials were in the wrong places. So you know how in a standard sort of American TV format, it sort of ramps up to the break and it pauses for the commercial, and then it continues the action at a place after that. So there were all of these sort of weird moments where you could tell that there was supposed to be a commercial, but because in a different country, sometimes those are actually placed in different locations, there wasn't a commercial there. And then the actual commercials did cut in the middle of the action, in the middle of the scene, and felt awkward and broke up the pacing. So it's fascinating to see, even though we have those constraints, the constraints that we think we have aren't even universal today, and they never have been.
Right. The QWERTY keyboard, I mean, to a certain extent, they are constraints because people are habituated, and creators often, into thinking that they are. But I've been thinking about this convergence, divergence relationship, because I lived through the multimedia revolution, if anyone remembers that word.
When the CD-ROM would change the world.
Well, people thought that the CD-ROM was actually, the creative medium, And we have a lot of this really interesting stuff in our collection from that era. But it was the word we used to describe combining a whole bunch of things into a single interactive experience. But it was defined in a way by what it is not, and how it is different from what came before it. In the meantime, what happened on the side is that you begin to have media experiences diverge among multiple platforms, and it's kind of a divergence. And one of the ways I've thought of what's happened recently in terms of how we describe media is that, in a sense, we've gone from these hard and fast categories to keywords, and from defining a medium based on certain constraints to thinking of them as attributes. So that, when I was way back when, we were working with somebody named Bob Bijan, and Sony created a company called Interfilm, which made what they called interactive movies. And except people like others I talked to said, no, it's a cinematic game. It's a floor wax, it's a dessert topping, and and the experience was the experience. It actually wasn't. I mean, it's interesting, I think, to look at it. Wasn't entirely successful, but what was fascinating was, again, how people could combine suddenly these words to describe them rather than have them sharply defined based on these technological constraints.
Well, I just want to say we're trying to keep to a certain time limit, and I appreciate that you've all joined us today. I want to send you off with my sincere thanks, but also encouragement to continue to go out there and reinvent the world of media, regardless of which terms we use to describe it. The work you all doing is exceptional, and will someday be in the Museum of the Moving Image. So thank you all for being here with us today. I really enjoyed the conversation. For those of you who followed us, please come back and join us for our weekly roundtable conversation every Wednesday at 12:30. There we go, a little plug for the Museum of the Moving Image. Thank you guys, and look forward to seeing you at the Future Storytelling Summit next October. Have a good day. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.